Welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. Your chance to learn about the teachings of the Catholic Church on sacred music, both in theory and practice. Through interviews, discussions, and music, your hearts and minds will be lifted up and better understand what it means to sing the praise of His glory. And now, your host, Dr. Jennifer Donelson-Nowicka.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. I'm really delighted to bring you an outstanding interview with Professor Thomas Forrest Kelly, the Morton B. Knopfel Research Professor of Music at Harvard. Today we're covering some of the topics from his excellent and approachable book published by Norton, Capturing Music, The Story of Notation. There's something for everyone in this interview, for those new to the history of music and for specialists in studying music notation. Here's the interview. Thanks so much for being here with me today, Tom.
It's a pleasure, Jennifer. Thanks.
I'd like to start with a quote you give in the introduction and first chapter to your book, Capturing Music, The Story of Notation. It's from St. Isidore of Seville, and he says, quote, "Since sound is a thing of sense, it passes along into past time, and it is impressed on the memory. For unless sounds are held in the memory by many, they perish because they cannot be written down." End quote. So could you give us a little bit more context for St. Isidore's quote? What sorts of written technology would have existed during his time for music? And how do you think his experience in what he's saying here was affected by his experience of the written word and its relationship to the spoken word and reading aloud? And how do those two things interact in what he's saying?
That's a really long question with a million parts. So I may not cover them all, but maybe everybody knows that Isidore of Seville is one of those people, maybe one of the last people who knew absolutely everything. That text comes from a book of his called Etymologies. And in it, he writes the definition of everything there is in the world, or so he thinks. And it's a great book, and it's about all possible subjects. This is one where he is writing about music. People cite this passage over and over again, mostly as proof that there was not any kind of musical notation in the 7th century when Isidore was writing. It is a useful quotation for that, but it seems to me it's much more interesting than that, because he's talking about time and memory as aspects of music. We don't usually think of those as the basic building blocks of music, but they are. What you anticipate in the future in music, when you're listening to music or making music, is based on what you did in the past, and it's all happening in the present, that kind of knife edge between the past and the future that is the moment that is really, as St. Augustine loves to say, is the only moment that exists. Everybody knows that the future doesn't exist, and everybody knows that the past doesn't exist. The past is created by us through memory. And so whether we use written music or not, we always engage our memory in the making of music. He's really talking about the process of music, as well as the fact that if music isn't retained in the memory, it doesn't exist because it can't be written down. Even if he left out the because it cannot be written down, it would be a really interesting statement. Unless music is retained in the memory, it doesn't exist. But it's generally used in a more practical sense to suggest that Isidore and his contemporaries didn't have any way of writing down music.
Do you think that he wouldn't have been able to imagine a sort of way, though? I mean, one of the next things I would like to talk with you about is how you sort of take us through different ways that a notation could be imagined or ways in which it functions.
Oh, yeah. I had a colleague at Harvard who taught an introductory music theory course, and the first assignment was, think of a way to show somebody else how to sing a melody, that is, invent a notational system. And your grade depends on what happens when that person learns your system and then somebody sings that person a tune and the person writes it in such a way that somebody else can reproduce it. And people tried all sorts of things. You can imagine the kinds of things that people try. They have to do with continuous lines going up and down. For some reason, people always come up with something that reads from left to right as time and from top to bottom as pitch, but not always. Sometimes people do top to bottom as pitch like a sort of a rolling tape, or something like that, like a teleprompter or something like that, where time goes top to bottom and something else would go from side to side. But the various ways that people choose to write music are kind of interesting, because whatever system there is for recording music is always desperately incomplete. I mean, our own musical system, which is actually based on medieval music, is desperately incomplete. Our music that we put up on the piano bench, or we hold our choral score or whatever it is, it really tells us only two things. It says, what note is it and how long does it last? It tells us nothing else. Everything else in our musical system has to be written in language or in symbols around the edges of the actual music. So we write the word crescendo, we write the word piccolo, we write the word staccato, or we put little dots or we put little hairpins, but that's ancillary to the music. So we have chosen only two things as primary, and that is, what note is it and how long does it last? But other kinds of notational systems privilege other pieces of information to the exclusion sometimes of the pitch or the duration.
Right. So could we maybe go into that a little bit more? And in your book, you talk about 4 different ways. So we covered a little bit here, representing musical sounds as notes, signs for action, signs for motion, and signs for formulae. Could you describe each of those a little bit and maybe give an example that in a way, a musical notation system that's existed in the past that used that?
Well, sure. Maybe the simplest thing, because it's the closest to our own concept, is the notation used in southern France in the area called Aquitaine in the 10th and 11th and 12th centuries, which really just consists of a series of things that look to us like just a whole bunch of dots. And each dot stands for a pitch, that is, for a note. So it's a sequence of notes, which is what we actually use in our own notational system, that each note is a sort of a sounded pitch for a certain length of time. It doesn't say how long it lasts, but it works that way. There are other kinds of things, and people who sing Gregorian chant or have ever looked at some of the earlier Gregorian chant notations will know some of these. There are things that seem to be kind of gestural. They indicate motion from one place to another. There's something called, it sounds very dinosaur-y, and it may be not a good name for it, but tends to be called Paleo-Frankish musical notation, in which a single stroke going up represents 2 pitches. That is, what it actually represents is the motion between 2 notes rather than the 2 notes themselves. And then there are the kinds of early neumes that group several sounds together, like a down, up, down sound, or an up, down, up, or series of sounds going in various directions that seem to be wishing to indicate a melodic line. We always say a melodic line as though it were a continuous thing, but then we break it up into individual notes. And that kind of notation, that sort of pneumatic notation, seems to be attempting to use as much of the line as possible, although it has to be broken up by the syllables and the words of the language. And then there's the kind of symbolic thing where a mark, a sign, or something could be a sort of a symbol that indicates something you're supposed to do. We have that in our earliest chant notations too, where some notes take on a particular unusual looking form. There's a form of a note called liquescence that indicates a place where the mouth changes shape and therefore the sound you're making changes, like on a diphthong, like ow, or a syllable that ends with a nasal sound or something that closes it off, alleluia, things like that. And then there are weird signs called quilisma and oriscus that seem to be symbols for making the note have a particular sound quality, even though we're not sure now exactly what that is. Or you could consider the Hebrew cantillation, the wonderful kind of way of, although in Hebrew, I think in the Jewish religion, you don't call it singing, but it sure sounds like singing to me, the reading of the Bible. And there are symbols that are used in the Masoretic text of the Hebrew Bible that indicate not only are there pointings for the vowels, but there are these symbols that are used to tell you how to deliver the text. And they're the same symbols, and they've been used all through the Jewish religion long after the diaspora and so forth, so that Ashkenazi and Sephardim and all sorts of different people use the same signs. And you would think, therefore, that that's the oldest notation in the world. And in a way it is. The only problem is that although they use the same signs, different groups make different sounds for the various formulas, so that they've grown apart. Anyhow, it has little signs, and each sign is a formula for a particular thing you do at a particular point. It's not a note, it's not a representation of something. You got to know that formula, that mark means execute this particular formula at this place, so that it's not really a representation of the music. It's a series of symbols that tell you how to sort of seeds that you plant, and then you produce this beautiful musical formula.
I'd like to come back a little bit later to talking about how that actually developed in different areas and whatnot in the church's repertory of music. But maybe for right now, we could just, take the assumption or take the historical fact that writing was introduced as a sort of technology. And I'd like to ask you some questions about what impact that had. For example, what effect did it have on the notion of oral transmission? Are there any traces of bishops or choir masters or theorists kind of opining about this shift between how music was handed on before the application of notation and after?
Well, there are the efforts. I mean, I'm not sure it's mostly bishops. The efforts at uniformity in the church come in the first instance, at least with respect to church music, not so much from Rome, but from the Carolingians. It's sort of Charlemagne and his successors who want to unify a multinational corporation. They've got people from all over Europe all of a sudden in this big unified Carolingian empire. And it's Charlemagne who decides that the authority of Rome is the thing that he can use to unify them. That's how, one of the reasons probably, he gets himself crowned Holy Roman Emperor. And it's also why he says we're going to use the same kind of writing everywhere. The monasteries are going to teach people things, and they're going to teach everybody the same thing. We're going to have this kind of writing called Carolingian or Caroline minuscule, and we're going to use the liturgy of Rome. And because we want to make sure it's the same everywhere, that's why we're going to teach people to write, because we're going to get books from Rome, and we're going to get singers from Rome, and we're going to learn how to do it. So there's a sense in which the idea of that kind of Rome-based uniformity was, at least in part, a political move on the part of somebody who had a whole lot of different nations under his partial control. And we know, I think, that there were, before that, because we have vestiges of them still, different kinds of liturgies with different kinds of music in the different parts of Latin Europe, not even to speak of Eastern Greek and other languages, but we have what's called the Ambrosian chant from the area of Milan. There was something called Gallican chant, of which we have almost no remnants. There was something called Beneventan chant down in southern Italy that all were part of the Roman liturgy, but used different forms of liturgy and different repertories of chant. But that all sort of disappeared, was swept under the carpet in the process of the unification of the Church of Rome.
One of the things that's evolved in recent decades in just general liturgical interest and scholarship is a sort of reaction to, especially the post-Tridentine centralization of the liturgy and the uniformity of things, and looking at variations in the church's rites and traditions and repertories, for example. There's a renewed sort of interest in this as a sort of legitimate expression of variation. Do you think that most people during this Carolingian sort of Renaissance might be a strong word for it, but a Carolingian centralization. Do you think there was a sort of resentment about the loss of a regional repertoire by anyone towards a centralized repertoire?
Yes, I do. But the evidence of it is, hard to find because of the well, I guess you might even use the word suppression of some of these other things. The one repertoire that survived intact was the Ambrosian repertory of the area of Milan, probably because of the authority of Ambrose, as was at least as strong as the authority of Gregory, Gregory the First, whose name was attached to the chant, even though he didn't have anything to do with it, really. But we can see in southern Italy the suppression of the Beneventan chant in the course of the 10th and 11th centuries. But some of the scribes down there who were making manuscripts, they sort of had some kind of local nostalgia or pride or something, and they hid a few pieces disguised as though they were pieces of Gregorian chant in their manuscripts. And it's as we go and look for these weird pieces and notice that they all have the same kind of musical style that's not Gregorian at all, that we realize there was a whole other body of music here that was kind of overrun by the importation of the Gregorian. It's not necessarily antagonistic and warlike. I wasn't there, and I don't know how they felt about the adoption of Gregorian chant instead of, say, Beneventan chant or Gallican chant. It might have been strongly resisted, it might not. I don't know. But we certainly do see that there are vestiges, and I imagine a kind of proud conservatism on the part of the people who refuse to completely quit writing down their local repertory.
Could you talk a little bit more about this, I guess a sort of side tangent, but you do address it in your book, just the appellation Gregorian and different theories about how it became named that, and its link, especially to this issue that we're talking about of coming from a supreme authority.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it was to Charlemagne's advantage, of course, that the authority should be sort of timeless and absolutely strongly authoritative. There's a very strong tradition that spread widely in Carolingian times about the authority of Gregory. It comes from a tradition, and there's the famous illustrative tradition where at the beginning of a whole lot of chant books in the Carolingian period, there's a picture of Gregory at the beginning and an introductory song that you sing before the beginning of the first piece in the book. The first piece in the book is Ad te levavi, the introit for the first Sunday of Advent. But before that, sometimes there's a picture. And you know how everybody knows what the picture looks like. It's St. Gregory sitting on a chair or a throne or something, and the Holy Spirit in the form of a dove either is flying towards him or sitting on his shoulder and singing into his ear. And then he makes the gesture of singing or of speech by holding his hand out. And then very often a scribe hiding behind a curtain or sitting at his feet or something writes down what the dove is singing into Gregory's ear. And the song that goes with it is, "Blessed Gregory, while in prayer to God, prayed that the gift of song might be sent to him. And it was done so by the Holy Spirit. And he began to sing, saying as follows, Te levavi." Yeah. The first thing he says is Ad te levavi. That is what it says. Yeah. St. Gregory dictated this book from the left edge to the right edge. That tradition actually comes from, there are earlier illustrations of Gregory doing that don't have anything to do with music, that have to do with him dictating his book about Job. But anyhow, the tradition came along in Carolingian times and has been very useful. And it may be that Pope Gregory II, maybe in the 7th and 8th centuries, maybe did have something to do with, if not creating, at least kind of organizing and codifying the chant, the Roman chant that we now call Gregorian.
Could you outline for us what you see in the way that chant might have been taught leading up to the use of musical notation, and then how it was taught sort of immediately after the introduction of writing?
Gosh, I don't know. To back up from that even, it's probably worth noting that so far as I'm able to tell, Gregorian chant was sung in monasteries and collegiate churches, that is, cathedrals or other churches that had regular bodies of resident clergy. I have no idea what people in parish churches in the Middle Ages, in Carolingian times or later, heard or did or sang. I really don't know. All the manuscripts we have, with just about with no exceptions that I know of, are for collegiate churches or monasteries. So you could hear chant if you went to one of those places, but you probably participated in chant only if you were a member of those communities. That might not be something that church musicians with a great desire to have all of the people participate in the liturgy would like to hear, but I just don't know what it was like in parish churches. But the way you learn chant, I don't know either, but here's my guess. My guess is that you joined the monastery or the convent at the age of, I don't know, 8 or 9 or 10 or so as a kind of an offering from your parents. And you, the first thing they do is say, okay, learn the Lord's Prayer. The next thing for you to learn is the Book of Psalms. And because in your community you go through the whole Book of Psalms every week, it's probably only 20 years or so before you know the Psalms pretty good, because you've been through them many, many times. And because you go to Mass every day, and because every day you sing the 8 office hours with their antiphons and their psalms and their responsories and their hymns, and the hymns change with the seasons and the antiphons change with the seasons, but the psalms change with the day of the week. Pretty soon you get so you can do it. And after you've been there for quite some time, it's pretty clear who's a good singer and interested in doing it well and who's not. And that those people who are probably invited to join the smaller group of people who sing the hard songs. And when you get really, really good, you might become the sort of cantor who's allowed to stand up and sing the solo verse of the gradual, or to sing the solo verse of the Alleluia, or those really elaborate verses of the offertory that we find in some medieval manuscripts. But I think those, the really, really hard, elaborate pieces were pieces mostly for soloists and mostly for highly experienced experts. So in a way, it was a kind of singing from memory, but it wasn't sort of hard work memory. It was memory that happens to you over time.
Immediately after the introduction of writing, do you think it had a very profound effect on the way that you would have learned? Because, I mean, what we're talking about in the initial books are things that are just intended for the choir master to look at, right?
Right. So, there's good old Guido of Arezzo, who's the guy who did the ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la stuff, and who said, why don't we draw some lines and make the notes higher and lower so we can tell specifically which note they are and call them A, B, C, D, E, F. All of that comes along with Guido, and is very, very cool. And he's able to show the Pope, teach the Pope to sing at sight an antiphon he's never seen before. Totally cool. And the idea that you can read music that you don't know is astounding, because up until that point, all the musical notation has been designed for people who already know the music and need to be reminded of it. In fact, even without notation, there were books that did that. There were books that had just the words of the chant in there. And we all know, I think, that in some cases can be sufficient. There are a lot of hymn books, for example, used in a lot of the Protestant denominations where there's nothing but the words. It says, "Oh God, our help in ages past." That's all you need, because you kind of know how the tune goes. And when my children were young, we had a tiny little book called, I don't know what, I think it was called America's Best Loved Songs. It was about 2 inches high, and it had the words of all the verses of Turkey in the Straw and all the verses of On Top of Old Smoky. And we used to sing, sitting around the dinner table, songs of that kind. And it was really useful, because who knows the second verse of Turkey in the Straw? But it didn't have any music in it, and we didn't need the music.
Right.
It was what we needed to make the music that we already knew how to make. And that's what most of those early notated manuscripts are about. But you're right, they're mostly quite small. They're sometimes the size of a National Geographic or something like that. And so they're not the kind of great big choir book that you see in the 13th and 14th and 15th centuries that put up on a lectern in the middle of the choir. They're probably books to look at before you go into Mass. To check on what are the songs for today, and are we sure that somebody's covering each of those songs, and do I remember how that goes? And then you go in and do it without any books in front of anybody, would be my guess.
When there was the move to large choir books, what impact do you think that had just on musical literacy and even just the conception of the liturgy? I'm thinking, for example, of when you're relying on something written in front of you, it's easier to let it not as deeply penetrate the memory. And so that really affects your deep learning of the material. And that deep, the liturgical experience is, especially for a monk, dependent on deep learning. Whether it's biblical exegesis and you see this text used on this particular day versus that particular day. What impact do you think that had just on people's conceptualization of the repertoire and of the liturgy?
Gosh, it's hard to know. The monks I know nowadays generally rely on the printed books that, actually the monks I know best are people who are monks of the monastery of Solesmes in France. And they're the people who produced a lot of the books that are used by people who sing Gregorian chant. But they use their books. And how deeply it penetrates, I don't know. My guess is that after 40 years or so, you get so you know the stuff whether you have the book or not. But the beginning, the learning curve must be very, very different. I know that the novices spend a lot of time learning the chant, but mostly what they learn is not the repertory of chant, but how you read the notation and how you read the book. And so my guess is that the literate approach to the liturgy is bound to be a little bit different from the illiterate. I don't mean to use the word illiterate in any derogatory sense, because almost everybody in the Middle Ages, at least, was illiterate, from the illiterate approach to chant. The illiterate approach, my guess is that half the time you wouldn't even understand what they were saying. How would you know for sure what language? Can you tell what I'm saying if I sing a text and I'm 20 feet away from you across the choir? I'm not sure. So it's probably a process of very, very gradual assimilation. As you hear the text of an antiphon that's drawn from the psalm you're about to sing, you might say, oh, yeah. That comes from this psalm, and that the antiphon is designed to put me in a mood to sing the psalm in a particular way today, which is different from the way I sing it when the antiphon is different. It's a sort of a guide to meditation and contemplation. And if I understand what it says, it's a whole lot better than if I don't. So my guess is that the medieval way of doing things was having the haze sort of gradually disappear from your understanding. Whereas a literate version means you've got all the words in front of you all the time, but as you say, it doesn't sink in. It's not interiorized in the way that it is when it's taken 20 years to get there. Guido of Arezzo says it takes 40 years to make a cantor. It takes a long, long time, and he says my new method is going to make it possible for people to sing songs that without having practiced for 40 years.
Right.
But of course, as you say, Jennifer, the way that song exists in your interior has got to be different when you're reading it from what it is when you've been singing it for 40 years and it's really part of you now.
Yeah. I think a lot of these conversations happen in conservatory training about, the large loss of the improvisatory tradition in conservatory training. With the exception of organists, most conservatory training doesn't inculcate a large amount of improvisatory or by ear learning of music. It's really textually based.
Absolutely, yeah.
But it's still retained in the sense that, especially for pianists, we're expected to memorize everything, although even that has shifted in recent years. But this notion of it sinking in and the development of a full array of musical skills by incorporating things which are illiterate, as you mentioned, that are learned in a different way from notation. I mean, what do you think a modern practitioner of chant, working in a parish, for example, with amateur musicians, can learn from thinking about those questions, or what are interesting ways?
Let me tell you about an interesting experience of mine. It may not be directly relevant, but I hope it is. One time, I did it more than once, but I'm thinking of a particular, I taught a freshman seminar at Harvard for a limited number, just 12 people was the maximum number of people. And I announced it was going to be a seminar on Gregorian chant. And I figured, well, this will be great. Nobody will want to take it. And I'll have it won't be my fault if nobody takes my course. Best work for me. Well, some kids did do it. And it was really, some of them were Catholic practitioners, but the majority of them were just people full of curiosity. And one of the things that was one of their assignments was to find, once they learned what an antiphon is, find an antiphon, memorize it, and teach the rest of the seminar that antiphon without reference to anything written down. So learn a song, teach it to us, and we will learn it, and we will then, by the end of the semester, have a repertory, a small repertory, but a repertory of pieces that we have learned by heart and have never seen written down anywhere. And that's one thing we did. And another thing we did was sing one of the office hours every time we met. We met in the early afternoon, so we sang the Office of Sext. Every time the class met, we ended by singing the Office of Sext. And after a while, they got so they knew the hymn by heart, they knew the antiphon by heart, they knew the psalm by heart, and they had just a little bit of the experience, maybe a tiny little bit of the experience of learning things gradually and by heart that might be a little bit like the medieval experience. I happened to be at a party in Los Angeles 2 or 3 months ago, and as it happens, 2 of the students in that seminar were there. And they ran over to me and sang the antiphon for the psalm at Sext. And the 3 of us, everybody thought we were totally crazy, but we were singing a Gregorian antiphon that we all had learned by heart. And it was really fun and very heartening to think that part of the point of that seminar was to get some glimmering of an understanding about what that sort of oral and memory-based culture might be like.
Yeah. Well, of course, there's the problem amongst a lot of church musicians and the culture generally that there is a lack of musical literacy, that the number of people who can read music is much lower than it used to be, I think. I haven't seen any recent polls on that, but that's my assumption and guess. But
I think a lot fewer people's children are taking piano lessons than used to.
Exactly.
And playing band instruments.
What you're outlining is a sort of happy medium between people learning from no notation and people learning from notation with musical literacy. Do you think that a mixture of those two things is something that would aid not only musical learning, but also a sort of spiritual, deep learning in a practical way at the parish level?
I do, but there's really nothing like sort of owning a song. We all know the songs that we learned when we were young. Memory is not really a problem. We almost all of us can remember all the songs that our mother ever sang to us, if we have the good fortune to have a mother who sang to us. We all know all the songs that were popular on the radio the summer we first fell in love as a teenager. And if you work at it, you probably realize that you know a very large amount of music that you could reproduce out of your head. And that's without any effort at occupying the memory. But there's a kind of ownership of those things that we learned when young that says something to me really, really important about how significant it is, the music that young people are exposed to and come to learn. So that's one thing, is that kind of oral memory for young people is a billion times more important than the music that you listen to later on. But yes, that's one kind of musical ownership. But the gift of being able to listen to and participate in and perform other kinds of music that you don't happen to have that ownership of, but you can kind of borrow for a while, that is by reading it out of a book or playing it on the piano or whatever, that's a great gift that allows us to expand our horizons far beyond what would be possible if we didn't have musical notation and, of course, recording technology, which is a blessing and a bane at the same time.
Yes. I'd like to wrap up with just a few questions about some more of the historical and orthographical sorts of things. So could you describe the relationship between the earliest iterations of neumes and grammar, punctuation, rhetoric, those sorts of things?
Yeah, well, some of the very basic things to say about the early notations is that they're based on language and come after it. I mean, all the notations that we have go from left to right because they exist to accompany the written words that they are the music for. And so they match the words. So the notation is written from left to right, which means the left to right kind of represents time. And that's a kind of a given. So if you have anything else you want to represent, you probably got to use the other dimension, the vertical axis. We use it for pitch. We probably could use it for volume or other things. There's also the rule, I don't know where it came from, and it's not a hard and fast rule in Byzantine notation, but it is a hard and fast rule in Western notation that you have to lift your pen after every syllable. There must be space between syllables. And you know that. Anybody who sings choral music will know that if you go, glow, you can beam them all together. But if they're on separate syllables, you have to have separate flags for those notes. And that's always been a rule of musical notation. I don't know why, but it also means that not only is the language itself, but the syllables of the language, and it therefore follows that the word breaks and the phrase breaks and the sentence breaks will also be observed. But then the sort of punctuation aspects of things. Yes, of course, there are ways of singing texts, the way you sing a prayer, the way you sing the gospel, the way you sing the epistle, the way you sing a lection at one of the offices. And there are lots of other, the way you sing a psalm are all based on the structure of the language. You have kinds of formulas that let you know this is the end of a large section of text. There are formulas that are say, this is a place where you might take a breath. It's a sort of a semicolon kind of formula. And there's sort of a comma kind of formula. And some things like gospels and other things also have a formula to let you know this is the end of the whole gospel reading for today. So that the formulaic kinds of music, even at the most simple versions, have ways of articulating not the meaning of the words. I don't think chant ever, or I think it's fair to say chant doesn't ever express the meaning of the words. It expresses the shape, the grammar, the rhetorical articulations of the words. And it does it very, very beautifully, so that you have music doing one thing and language doing another thing, and they're complementary but not the same.
That's a really important point. And I think, especially pious people who sing chant as prayer sometimes get a little bit fanciful in their analysis of chant, meaning, kind of analyzing it as word painting or leitmotifs from in a Wagnerian sense.
No, yeah. I mean, of course, when you have the word altissimo, you're either going to have a high note or a middle note or a low note. And every time you get a high note, you think, see, there's word painting. But think about this. Suppose you were composing Gregorian chant and you wanted to make it expressive of the meaning of the words and of its place in the liturgy. So the introit for Easter, I am arisen and I am with you, alleluia. Now, if you gave Johann Sebastian Bach that text to set to music for Easter Day, you know perfectly well it would have 2 oboes, 2 flutes, 3 trumpets, a big pair of kettle drums, a big string band, and it would be loud and how does it go in Gregorian chant? Resurrexi. It just, it sounds not like Easter, it sounds like an introit. And if you use those same words elsewhere in the Mass, it would sound like a gradual or like an offertory or like a communion. And that's the way Gregorian chant works. And if you don't like it, go listen to Bach cantatas.
Touché. So could you, going back to the writing a little bit, could you describe for me the differences you see in the earliest families of neumes? And here I'm thinking of, for example, the differences between Senegal neumes and those you referred to earlier, the Paleo-Frankish neumes.
Yeah. This is a sort of a tricky subject, and it's not so well understood, but somebody who's really, really interested in it should get a wonderful book by Susan Rankin called Writing Sounds in Carolingian Europe. But you've got to put your thinking cap on if you're going to read that book. But essentially, Western notation is akin in lots of ways, using left to right and up and down. But as I mentioned before, the Paleo-Frankish notation has the remarkable thing of being gestural. That is a single sign that would represent that would represent a single note at St. Gall that would look like a virga at St. Gall represents 2 notes going up in Paleo-Frankish, and a little thing that looks like an upside down cup represents 3 notes down, up, down, so that it's directions and motions rather than events. Most of the other kinds of notation represent individual notes or groups of notes, so that the St. Gall notation, people who are interested in early notations will probably know the St. Gall notation and the Long notation, because those are the ones that are written in the Graduale triplex. If you know what I mean, you know what I mean. If you don't worry about it. But it's a wonderful chant book in square notation that has had the neumes of two very important early manuscripts added by hand, so that you can see what this chant looked like in the notation of two different very early scribes. And one of the wonderful things is that although they do it differently, the Long notation tends to be separate, a lot of separate notes, and the St. Gall notation tends to be several. There's a lot of signs that group 2 or 3 or more notes together in a single very beautiful sinuous sign. Despite those differences, you can tell that they're representing the same music, and not just the same music in terms of a sequence of notes and pitches, but the same music in terms of certain other expressive nuances of performance that people spend an awful lot of time studying and indeed disagreeing about.
So if they are representing the same sort of sounds, what do you think accounts for the geographical variation in neume styles? Is it just simply transmission?
Well, one thing it says, doesn't it, is that the music was there before the notational styles came along. Because although the notational styles are different, they're all writing down the same music. It's almost miraculous, seems to me, that in Long and St. Gall and in Aquitaine and in southern Italy and in a bunch of other places too, in Winchester in England, they're writing down what's amazingly the same repertory. The Roman liturgy, yes, the same text for the Roman liturgy, but also pretty close to exactly the same music. How they managed to remember so precisely that huge body of music with such accuracy is a miracle that I'll never understand.
Yeah, it goes a long way in convicting us of maybe how much attention to memory and memory capacity we've lost, especially in a digital age.
I think we have it. We just don't exercise it. We need to go to the memory gym.
Yeah. If I could just... My final question to you is a little bit of a fanciful one. If you had to go through that same sort of exercise you were describing happened in that seminar of inventing a method of notating Gregorian chant that captures what you would like to consider most important in written transmission, and then marginalize those other things which you felt could be passed along in some other way, what would it look like? Would it look like one particular style that exists, or would you tweak it in some way?
That would depend, of course, on whether you wanted to be like Guido and make sure that people could read it right off the bat, or whether you could make a notation that you were using for people who had already been singing the Gregorian chant for 40 years, and you wanted to make sure they got the nuances the way you like it correct. And that's, in a way, what the big difference we see between those early notation, which are kind of nuance-based notations. They're not teaching people who don't know the songs. They're reminding people who do know the songs, and they're probably reminding them of kind of performance detail. Whereas the Guido kind of stuff, once we get to the musical staff and separate notes that are absolutely clear as to what the pitch is, all those nuance signs disappear. All those quilismas and oriscuses and things like that disappear from the notation. So I don't know. The answer would have to be, depends on who it's for.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Tom. This was really wonderful. I recommend heartily your book, Capturing Music, The Story of Notation, especially for people who maybe feel a little bit lost by the sort of more in-the-weeds discussion of minutiae in terms of musical notation and chant.
Things can get complicated fast, but the basic ideas are ones that I think almost anybody can understand.
Right. Yeah, and you do such a great job of explaining those in your book.
Very kind. Thank you for saying so.
Well, thank you so much for being with me today, and I hope that maybe we'll be able to do this again in the future.
With pleasure. Thanks very much, Jennifer.
We hope you've enjoyed listening to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast with Dr. Jennifer Donelson-Nowicka. For more information about this episode, sacred music resources, or upcoming events, visit our website at sacredmusicpodcast.com. You can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, or your favorite podcast app. If you enjoy our podcast, please write us a review on iTunes. This improves our iTunes ranking. and helps others find out about the podcast. The music you heard at the beginning of this episode is Hec Dies by William Byrd, sung by the London Oratory Schola Cantorum Boys Choir, directed by Charles Cole from the CD Sacred Treasures of England. The music at the conclusion of this podcast is from the Prelude and Fugue in G major, BWV 550 by Johann Sebastian Bach, performed by Jennifer Donelson-Nowicka. We look forward to having you join us next time, and until then, may we sing the praise of His glory.